So it's now my huge pleasure to introduce the speaker for tonight, Ainsley Henriquez. I've been lucky enough to have met Ainsley quite a few years ago. I cannot remember exactly when, but during one of his several terms as chairman of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. And earlier this year, he drove a small group of us to see the ruins of the wonderful Great House Stokes Hall at the far east end of the island, and then on to visit his brother's Crocodile Sanctuary. And an interesting family indeed, the Henriquezes are. And being with Ainsley is a constant education. His talk tonight will focus on the Jewish cemeteries of Jamaica. And as you will learn, these have a long history, with the earliest known marker of a Jewish settler being 1672, found in the Hunts Bay Cemetery in Kingston by Ainsley. However, I will not seek to second guess what else he is going to present to us today or tell us about today, but without more ado, we'll hand over to him now. Ainsley, over to you.
Hey, Green, thank you. Good evening to all. And from Jamaica, I'm only going to say good afternoon to all because it's much earlier here than it is in England. I'm going to try to give you a brief presentation of a history of island Jamaica, because that's the basis for what we are going to be looking at in a number of different versions, or shall we say institutions that we have in the island. The first, of course, was that Jamaica was populated for the first time by people in the 5th or 6th century AD. That's 500 to 700 AD, by a tribe of people coming out of South America. They were known as the Taino. And then subsequently, what we have is that the Spanish turned up in 1494. They didn't land, they came to visit. Remember, they sailed from Spain in 1492, and this was the second voyage. Columbus, of course, in charge. And then on the fourth voyage, they arrived here in 1503. Now that was interesting because they came here literally as castaways. And so as a result of that, they lived on the island for over a year. I claim that they were the first long stay visitors, but none of those were Jewish for a very simple reason. Jews were not allowed to live in Spain, as we all remember from the 1492 Inquisition order by Ferdinand, that Jews were either to leave or to convert. And so that's another story. They fled from Jamaica after about a year and a half, and they were taken up and carried back to Spain via the fledgling settlement in the Dominican Republic. And that was the end of any activity, literally, until, of course, about 10 years later, the Spanish started to settle in Jamaica. And they did so until 1655. So that was a long period of Spanish, but it was also an interesting period because Jamaica never had any mineral wealth. So the numbers of people that lived in Jamaica were not huge. In fact, we estimated, or at least it was estimated, that there were no more than about 2,000 people in the island at any one time. Now there's a whole new historical set of information that took place in 1655 or thereabouts. Most of us will remember, if we have read any history, that Cromwell disposed of the monarchy, and as a result of that was also part and parcel of trying to create something which is known as the Grand Western Design, to ensure that the European associates did not take over or run the whole of the Caribbean and the South and the Atlantic. And as a result of that exercise, he also wanted to make sure that there was no armada being mounted again to capture England. And he couldn't depend on God to push a nice wind through the North Sea, through the Channel, and disperse the Spanish. I'm being naughty, but that's part of the story. But Cromwell was also interested by a man named Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi from Holland, because the Jews had fled to Holland from Portugal to be able to return to practice Judaism, because they had been conversos in the Portuguese, in Portugal. And so by the end of the 16th century, they started to arrive in Portugal, arrive in Holland and return to practicing Judaism. So it became a whole new story of where were they going to continue to live. And by then, Holland had become a major settler of exponent of settling in the Caribbean and in South America. Of course, Brazil was one of the first places that they made a major township in Recife. And so that's a whole other story. And Jews were allowed to settle there because of the Dutch acceptance of Judaism as Jews. So here we go to the beginning of Jewish settlement in Jamaica, and Cromwell allowed Jews to settle in Jamaica from as early as 1656. Okay, so the English settlement took place in Jamaica in a little town, or what was created as a little town, at the entrance to Kingston Harbor. Kingston Harbor being one of the being the seventh largest natural harbor in the world. And it became a major place for English naval support practice to be able to protect themselves, as we spoke about, from the arrival of other European nations. And as a result of that, within 25 years, adequate amount of Jewish migrants to Jamaica were able to create a synagogue in Port Royal. But they could not bury their dead in Port Royal because the water table then, as it is now, was much too high to be able to dig a grave adequately to bury a casket. So they were able to take over a piece of land on the other side of the harbor, on the northern side of the harbor, and that today is known as Hunts Bay. And as Peregrine had indicated, one of the interesting aspects of Hunts Bay was that it was deep enough, the land was careful enough, big enough for them to be able to open up a cemetery over there. And the first cemetery that was found in Hunts Bay was a marker for a grave of 1672 for a man named Gabay. Now, I have to admit that part of this historical fact was that prior to 1650s, all Jews had been removed from England as early as 1290. And this exercise allowed Jews to start to settle back in England after 1655. It was really quite an amazing experience for both sides of the Atlantic to all of this to happen. And so as a result of that, Jews settling as migrants in Jamaica came primarily and initially from Holland. But as we discovered over the years, people suffering from anti-Semitism in other European countries made their way to Jamaica. Not as families in particular, but people seeking a way to live. And that in itself breeds a whole nother story of the integration and the assimilation of Jews and those who were enslaved or now manumitted from African capture, working on the plantations. And we won't go into that because I'm not here to discuss that. I'm talking about cemeteries. So Cromwell himself was quite an interesting man. And of course, one of his activities, as I said, was having a relationship with the Jewish rabbi from Holland, Manasseh ben Israel, who died, interestingly, before Cromwell completed what his work was, and before he himself was removed from being head of England and was properly and was then executed. So that's the story of the beginning of Hunts Bay. And it also highlights the role that Kingston Harbor played in England's role as a major player in the Caribbean and the protection of its own interests for the question of maintaining the protection against Spain, and also, as one would say, the protection of the amount of gold and silver being transported to Spain from the New World. And again, I'm going to cut that short because the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean is a story all by itself, and we don't want to bring that into cemeteries. Okay. Jews were not considered citizens in Jamaica, and neither were the manumitted former enslaved persons. All of this took place many years later, after legislation was founded with the beginning of the argument on emancipation as early as 1831. And finally, emancipation only took place in Jamaica and around the English world, the Commonwealth world, in 1838, full free. So that's a whole nother story. And then it leads us to the question as what were Jews allowed or encouraged to do in Jamaica for the years from the 1650s until the 1830s. And what we find is that largely you don't know what they were able to do. You wouldn't know where they were living, then you wouldn't know where they were going to be buried. There was certainly in those days no Ford motor cars or Mercedes Benzes to take the bodies to the mortuary. It was all done by horse and buggy. So the idea was that apart from Hunts Bay, which existed and it's been started as a cemetery, Jews started to settle around where the economic activities started to take place. The economic opportunities were in no part of the exercise of the power of the plantation system, which had been built and was being built by enslaved persons and plantation owners, and in particular, the activity for living as Jews was also not easy because there were no synagogues which people could walk to or go to easily because they lived primarily in the port towns, and they settled in the port towns as merchants and in some cases simply as artisans. So that is how the Jamaican Jewish communities started and then created their own cemeteries adjacent to where they were living. The only explanation I have was that my great-grandfather himself was a shopkeeper in a town called Morant Bay. But when he died, my aunt was one of the first women to be able to have a motor car license. So she drove her father and her mother on the occasion of their death to a local cemetery in Kingston. Otherwise, it would have taken hours for them to get the bodies to a Jewish cemetery. And there were no Jewish cemeteries in the town where I came from. So let us take a little time and travel around Jamaica and understand some of its economic activities, where people lived, who lived where there was opportunity, where will we find Jewish cemeteries, their size, and why those and their relatives are buried there. Of course, the earliest, of course, as I mentioned, was Hunts Bay, which was also used for years by those who moved to Spanish Town after the 1692 earthquake. The 1692 earthquake damaged a lot of what was built by then in Jamaica. And it wasn't very much because it was the remnants of a Spanish capital in Spanish Town. And of course, the synagogue, which was recorded as having been destroyed in Spanish Town, had been built only a decade before. So, having moved to Spanish Town and not stayed where the damage of a third of the population, of a third of the town of Port Royal sank, they eventually ended up moving from burying in Hunts Bay to opening synagogues in cemeteries in Spanish Town. The major cemetery in Spanish Town was what was initially used for what was a primarily Portuguese or Sephardic community. And today, unfortunately, it was sold years and years ago and holds up a very successful supermarket. I have many, many ancestors that are part of holding that supermarket from sinking. there are two other cemeteries in Spanish Town. There was a very important synagogue which was built in Spanish Town after the earthquake of 1692. It was created in the early 1700s in the style of Bevis Marks of London. And unfortunately, it does not exist any longer, but we know where it is. And I have had a very interesting set of experiences being able to pray on the site where it is, but not being able to sit down or have any other activity. Unfortunately, as I have had to be able to pray and practice Judaism in Bevis Marks in London. I just throw that in because it doesn't even have it's just a tree. The whole of the service took place under a tree. The Spanish Town also has another smaller cemetery that exists, and that was primarily of the mid-1700 Ashkenazim that started to arrive in Jamaica mainly from Eastern Europe, people who fled the rising elements of anti-Semitism, and men in particular who were seeking a new set of opportunities. And so that small cemetery still exists, not in the best condition. And that's part of the reason why I'm not sharing pictures with you, because to maintain cemeteries is not a cheap exercise. And the main one we manage today is the big one, in which all ethnic aspects of Judaism are recognized, Sephardim and Ashkenazim. And that's not really what it's all about. What's interesting is that we move on now to discover that one of the interesting ones that we had put on the picture was the cemetery of Falmouth. And why was because it's a small walled cemetery in the town of Falmouth, which became a major entrepot because of the Queen of Spain Valley's production of sugar, molasses, and rum. And as a result of that, it became a major settlement. Interestingly, and very interestingly, much of what became Falmouth was land which was owned by Elizabeth Barrett Browning's grandfather. And he wasn't Jewish, but it's an interesting aspect of relationship with things that took place during the period of plantocracy and the role of plantation owners, as well as people who fled or came to the towns where they had opportunities to get jobs. And as a result of that, the cemetery that you see in the process of being restored is the Falmouth Cemetery within the walls that exist. And in the far distance, you can see the sea. So it was not right beside the sea. It was far enough from the sea that if anything took place, it would be protected. So that's the story of Falmouth. And of course, in Montego Bay, as we go along, there were two cemeteries. Today, there's only one. What happens when they are not being maintained, or there's a decrease in the amount of Jews that live in a community, then these are actually turned into or sold to other opportunities for people. And as a result of that, that's why I mentioned the situation with the Spanish Town Cemetery, which is now a site for a very successful supermarket. Let me go back to Kingston. Kingston started in the 1690s after the earthquake, and had reportedly at least one cemetery in its west and another in my time at the top of what is known as Church Street and North Street. This cemetery is no longer visible, built over. Today we have two still in use, one for all, as I mentioned earlier, in which everybody who wishes to be buried and is accepted to be buried as a Jew is able to be placed there. And there's another smaller one, which is used primarily by the remnants of old Ashkenazi families. So that's part of the story of Kingston Cemetery. However, we have found a few graves in what was a yard that is now owned and operated by the police. but we have not identified really if it was a cemetery as yet. More work still needs to be done. And it was probably an expansion of the Ashkenazi cemetery on the other side of the road, where the police actually were able to acquire. So let me move on and very simply talk about the town of Montego Bay. Now, I don't need to talk much about Montego Bay because it was, in a sense, a town for the import of goods and the export of production from the plantation. And in those early days, in the mid-1700s, it became a place where one family turned up, a family named Mendez. And by the end of the 18th century, by the early 19th century, some of those people migrated to other parts of the world. And today we recognize that perhaps the most important rabbi in North America was Henry Pereira Mendez, whose father was born in Montego Bay and became a rabbi in Birmingham. And my claim to fame, of course, is the fact that I'm a relative of that family. So here you have it. Montego Bay's congregation diminished significantly over the years, and there was one synagogue there and another cemetery that existed but has no longer been around. So there's one small Jewish cemetery in Montego Bay, and now we have a Jewish community there. Whether they use the Jewish cemetery that exists is another story, but it's part and parcel of where people feel comfortable and want to be put, in particular where their families have some relationship with the cemetery in itself, because it's forever. So, okay. The cemetery that we have on picture, as I mentioned, is the Falmouth Cemetery, Falmouth Jewish Cemetery. And most of the people in Falmouth were, I believe, shopkeepers and their families. And that's really those graves that you see being restored there. And this is a story of many of the smaller cemeteries, because this has a number of graves of smaller cemeteries that were created because of the difficulty and the effort to be able to move a body from where they died to a cemetery, a major cemetery elsewhere. As a result of that, the idea was that we had at some stage, our count we had somewhere like 23 Jewish cemeteries. Today, we only count roughly about 13. However, the story is really quite fascinating because of one of the most important things is the tradition that Jews go through to be able to bury. One of the most important things is that all graves face east, face Jerusalem. Another argument is that it's not necessary to have high vertical statuary or markers on the graves, but it does make them much easier to be seen. And as you see here, a lot of the slabs here are on brick structures, partly to be able to remove or to raise the slabs on which the inscriptions are from the likelihood of flooding. And in those days, they also had flooding, as we have today based on climate change. So it's a whole story of tradition of how these early graves were put. And the bricks, of course, were not made in Jamaica. To a large extent, these were part of the ballast that brought ships with produce to collect produce from Jamaica. Do we have anything in that area to be able to relate to Jewish cemeteries? No. We have basically only the inscriptions on the slabs. And interestingly, a lot of the slabs are in beautiful marble with lovely inscriptions. And one of the exciting or interesting things was, where did the marble come from? And much of that early marble was inscribed and we believe brought to Jamaica from England to be placed on these graves. It wasn't a cheap exercise, but at the same time, it tells us a number of stories. It tells us of the wealth of the people who were practicing Judaism to be able, when one of the family died, to find the money to bring these slabs to be able to mark graves that were being created. So that's another interesting aspect of what the graves tell us about these people. And of course, we can continue. Lucy, on the other side of Montego Bay, also has a small cemetery. And what is interesting there, it is on the way to Negril. And we have one particular American Jew who every time he comes to stay in Negril on vacation, spends some money to be able to keep that small cemetery, where I think not more than a dozen graves, tidy. So that's a good Samaritan position to have from a nice American Jew. We don't have any Jews living in that part of the world at the moment. And you go down across the coast, we come to Sav-la-Mar or Savannah-la-Mar. And that cemetery was too close to the coast and was damaged by a hurricane in the 1790s. And I think we only can find literally about 3 tombs that exist today. But we do know it was a cemetery. And the house that is built in there, I don't think is a legitimate investment. But at this stage of life, I'm not sure anybody wants to pick it up and deal with it. Alligator Pond along the south coast also has a lovely little cemetery, similar with the idea that it was moved far enough from the coast that it could not be damaged by any activity of flooding or from hurricane. It's in a grove of trees, and it's a lovely little forest. And those Jews were there building ships in Alligator Pond. So that's another story. And of course, when you look at the names of these people, you can look into some elements of Jamaican history and find out that that family's name in particular was a simple name, Sampson. So back in the north, we come back now to St. Anne's Bay, and there's a small cemetery there too, based on a slope. And that was one of the major people involved in that cemetery was a family named Bravo. And what's interesting about Bravo is it identifies the role that Jews had to play with the local people. And one of the men that was a part of the, shall we say, the influence by the Bravo family was the famous Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And so it tells us another story. It tells us another story that having had a cemetery in St. Anne's Bay and a family named Bravo, who were involved in the elements of St. Anne's Bay and were able to open their doors in their home or their library to a man who became perhaps more the most important man of African ethnicity in the New World, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And I'm very proud that I've been able to entertain a descendant of the Bravo family, to be able to share some of that information with them. Yes, let me tell you also, that family no longer is a practicing Jewish family, but it doesn't matter, they're part of the family. Family is, in one sense, more important than how you believe. So I continue with that story. Let me change slightly and say that the whole concept of moving a body during the 18th, 17th, and 18th, and 19th, early 19th century was very difficult. Horse and buggy. And so my story of my own great-grandfather and having my grand-aunt have a vehicle to drive the body to a cemetery in Kingston is really a fascinating experience that I learned from her as to how important it is, because Jews wish to practice the burial of their loved ones as soon as it is practical. And so as a result of that, we do not bury on the Sabbath, but we want to find a way to be able to bury after that as soon as possible. And of course, as I say, and I'm repeating, to be able to place the grave in a cemetery, the casket in a cemetery, pointing to the east. So these are part of the interesting points of Jewish practice. What is also interesting is that marble slabs on top of graves has been a difficulty because they are not difficult to remove. And as a result of that, as people opened up their opportunities to be able to create their own small homes, some people, not all, and not many, remove slabs and use them for flooring, or also use them upside down to be able to bury their own. And so as a result, in the more recent years, those of us who can afford it are now burying our dead using granite, which we buy primarily from the United States of America. And we are able, as a result of this, to be able to have standing markers at the head of a grave. So on that, we can also inscribe the information that we want to put on that person's grave, and it becomes a much more comfortable experience. This top of the slab is also something that may have a name or an inscription, but more importantly, one of the traditions of Jews is to be able to place a stone on the top of the slab in respect of the person who is buried beneath. And so a nice big slab on top of a grave is a nice place to be able to place a stone and be able to say if a prayer, if you wish to say a prayer on behalf or for the person who is buried. So I can continue. Let me share now from a different perspective. Knowledge of who and where and when and why people were buried in various cemeteries took place in the 1950s by two remarkable people. One was Philip Wright, an Englishman born in Middlesex, who read classics at Oxford. He married a Jewish woman from the United States, a woman named Adele Cohen. And as a physician, her work took them to live in Jamaica for 9 years. He retired to England in 1961. He worked with cemeteries in Jamaica, and his work with the Jewish cemeteries was with Richard Barnett, an archaeologist and scholar from England. Their work, The Jews of Jamaica, which is a beautiful bound document, and I don't think you can see it, but it's all right, I have a copy here, was finally published by the Ben-Zvi Institute in Israel in 1997. It took quite a while because, you know, who would want to spend money to be able to support a document that was not cheap to be put together on cemeteries and on people's graves? It takes a bit of courage to do that, and it was done. And the work was done cemetery by cemetery from both Jewish burial records in Jamaica and the cemeteries themselves. They created a record of the inscriptions by number and then in an alphabetical register of all the names with their numbers and the cemeteries in which these people were placed. This became an index with their dates and numbers so that each name in this record can be easily found. This record became my beacon for future genealogical work. And yes, I needed to have some genealogical work done for my own information as to who I am. The question is, why did I have this request? Well, simply because my grandfather took himself to Philadelphia, went to have dinner with a young lady that he told her at dinner he would marry, and she told him absolute nonsense. She was an Orthodox Jewess who had fled from the Ukraine, a village in the Ukraine, and ended up in Philadelphia. And as a result of that, he did marry her. My mother was born, and subsequently I was able, as a young person, to be able to visit Philadelphia after the war and meet my great-grandmother, who still spoke no English. So I now know that I have an Ukrainian grandmother. And then I said to myself, let me check out my father. And subsequently, I was able to find that my mother ancestor fled Portugal in 1492 and ended up in Istanbul. And her ancestor from Istanbul was a Hebrew teacher that arrived in Jamaica in 1745. Yes, I've been around since then. I'm not that old, but I've been around since then. So the idea of knowing your genealogy and knowing your heritage and knowing your history is important to most of us, most of us. So that record of that book became my beacon for future genealogical work. That light was relit at a conference at the John Carter Brown Library with a presentation by my now very dear friend Rachel Frankel on her work on the Jordan Savannah, the Jewish settlement in Suriname, Jewish settlement and plantations in Suriname, up the Suriname River. Her published work on that effort is entitled Remnant Stones. And from that experience and my friendship with her and having worshipped and the Caribbean Volunteers expedition were subsequent over the subsequent 15 or so years, and the dozens of volunteers every January who came was an amazing experience, and indeed one that I still reflect on with much joy.
Came to Jamaica.
The work they did in Jamaica on cemetery after cemetery by measuring, photographing, and cataloging all markers was amazing. And also all the inscriptions in the Hebrew and Portuguese have been translated. They didn't have to translate the English. I'm not telling you that we did that as well. These records are still being cataloged and entered into a computer program. The story is for genealogical work. The work from the grave markers to the screen will be for all to use from when we have to admit that then we have many more, I beg your pardon, I mixed up. From what we have to use from home. In one boast that we had completed our registration of all our burials before Israel was simply because we have much less graves than they do, but we did actually finish before they did. This work on the cataloging and loading of the data is now being done by the Jamaica Jewish Cemetery Preservation Foundation, and I hope that their efforts will be completed shortly. So that's another vision as to what has been done to the use and information on Jewish graves in Jamaica. And so a question that I want to put on the table for all is, what do we do with all this data? And yes, there are some answers. Many people today do not need to harass the records office of the government agencies for data of ancestors and return for more data that they may wish to continue to build their family histories. The Jamaican records were initiated, believe it or not, in the 1680s. Births, marriages, and deaths were initially the responsibility of the churches through their vestries, and then subsequently gathered by the Island Record Office and the Government Record Department. Excellent work by all over these years, not yet digitized for public use, but hopefully soon. Interesting that the government gave permission in the 1980s for the Mormon Church to research these records, and many can be accessed online today. Understanding names, ancestries, and more building blocks to understand from whence we have come in the many countries of our origins. The argument of what we brought and that impact on present generations, their thinking, culture, and behavior is interesting and perhaps a subject for further discussion. Out of many, one culture could be the new motto for all Jamaica. One sad experience, and that can be partly solved, is by DNA research to support the information from gravestones by themselves by these analyses. One real pity is the horror of enslavement, as there are no recorded enslaved cemetery sites in Jamaica, and there are no markers for burials. One solution that I've often repeated our archaeological department is to finance ground-penetrating radar machines to search sites for grave sites and individual graves. This would only tell us where, but not who, and perhaps from where they came, while plantation records may speak to other facts. So, my friends, to close, one has to recognize the value of learning from whom you descend, to determine why they came and where they are buried. Let me share my joy which was to find out one of my mother's ancestors, as I earlier mentioned, came initially from Amsterdam in 1745 as a Hebrew teacher. And that where he came from was from Portugal in 1492. So today, my ethnicity, my religion, and most of my understanding of who my ancestors are or were removes much of the problem many people hold on to without proper understanding of who and why they were or why they came and from where in migratory communities, such as most of the world. And let me close by simply saying, yes, I am very comfortable to be a Jamaican practicing Judaism. And I'm open to any such questions that you may wish to ask.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Ainsley. That was absolutely fascinating. And in my mind prompts, well, a few questions, but am I able, Megan, to see other people if they raise their hands?
Yeah, you should be able to, but I will keep an eye out as well, because we do have quite a few people who have joined us, which is good. I don't think we've got any questions just yet.
Ainsley, I've got a slightly banal question. Is that there's a sort of a custom, certainly of the grander graves in Christian churches, of having quite a bit about the person buried written on a tablet. You know, that what generally the good things that they've done in their lives and how admirable they were, and what they did. Does that happen on the marble table tombs in Jewish cemeteries? I mean, in other words, is there more about the person than just their name and dates?
Not really. It was very little. It may have had something about merchant or or lawyer or attorney or something, but nothing else really, and certainly not where they lived or anything like that. I can't recall of seeing anybody's gravestone that said where they came from or where their ancestry was. So that's really part of the story. And I mentioned briefly, I mean, we do the synagogue, the Jewish records of Jamaica were fairly quite extensive from the 1790s. And the reason why they can't be found before that is because of the fires that took place in Jamaica, in Kingston in particular. There was a major fire subsequently, again after the 1800s, to 1882, which destroyed the other synagogues. So we were very lucky to actually have the ones we do have. But before 1797, we have literally no records that we can find easily. But I want to go back to the 1680s and the idea that the English management of Jamaica as a colony was extraordinarily good, in that it did collect a lot of information and did protect it properly. And so from that point of view, I think we are very blessed to be able to have sources of information that are not as easily found in most countries in the world.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether there are any others, otherwise I might follow up with another question. Megan, is there?
Yeah, that sounds good. And just a reminder that yeah, you're very welcome to post your questions in the chat if that's easier. Yeah.
Thank you. Ainsley, I know that I think it was a fact you put in the initial biography you sent, that there was obviously a huge amount of intermarriage with between the Jewish population and others, and presumably also with either manumitted or enslaved people. Did their progeny become Jews, and are they then buried in the cemeteries?
If you're a practicing Jew, there was no problem. and it has nothing to do with ethnicity. If you were not a practicing Jew, or if you were intermarried, you would have to, you could be buried in the Jewish cemetery, but your spouse would not necessarily have been buried in the Jewish cemetery if they had not converted to Judaism.
Okay.
So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is really quite fascinating, of Jews in Jamaica. And at one stage, we had two very significant members of the former Jewish community. One was the bishop of the Anglican Church, and the other one was the person who ran the prayers of the synagogue. They were cousins with the name D'Souza. So we were making sure that whatever you believed in, we had it covered. And I use that because, you know, it's not an easy thing for people, in particular in Europe or in some parts of the world, to recognize that Jews actually were able to get along with each other and others who are not Jewish. And maybe I should really perhaps explain myself too, because 60 odd years ago, I married a woman whose mother, a Catholic woman, whose mother was, whose aunt was a nun in the Catholic Church. And she had lived in Boston with a Jewish family. And about 3 years after we got married, she said, I know more about Judaism than you do, so I'm going to convert with a rabbi. She did. I don't know that she did end up knowing more than I did, but it was, she became a very active and practicing Jewess. And so, yes, anything is possible in Jamaica.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think the story really is that, you know, many of us have cousins and relatives who today are not Jews, who are practicing in other churches and in other religions. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's nothing that is against anybody's belief system. And it's extraordinarily comfortable to be able to know that you can walk on the street and you're not going to be attacked because people see you going to a synagogue or into a church or even into the mosque. And it's really quite an amazing country to live in. And that's why I said I'm proud to be a Jamaican and a Jew.
Peregrine, it's
Yes.
Bill.
Hello.
Hello. I'm curious if you've come across any evidence of Jewish religions, edifices or buildings in Falmouth.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understood clearly. I mean, what in Falmouth, Jewish, what we find, let me answer what I think you said. The element of where Jews lived in Falmouth was part of the parcel of what you find in the doorpost of houses where they lived, which is a mezuzah. Jews put a mezuzah on the right-hand side of the entrance to a building. And so that is where we have found where some people would have lived as Jews. And there's no problem, it can stay right there. It may be good for the people who are not Jewish to live in the same house. But that's the only evidence of really anything other than a cemetery where we have any recognition of where Jews lived or what they did. And the only thing we have on what they did was really the history books that say that this man was and I see one of the famous families in Falmouth is actually on the program, and the Delgado family is an important merchant family from Falmouth. Welcome, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. But is there a synagogue in Falmouth? I want to know that, the answer to that question.
Was there what, a synagogue?
Yeah.
No. We suspect that what took place where people conducted Jewish prayers, was that usually probably in somebody's home on a Friday night. And they would have had a similar experience maybe on a Saturday morning or for a particular holiday. But there was no evidence that there were some synagogues or places put aside for Jewish practice other than synagogues.
Preparation for bar mitzvah.
You know, preparation bar mitzvahs took place in synagogues, so people would move to a place where a synagogue existed to be able to practice, because one of the aspects of Jewish prayer on a Shabbat would be to take out the scrolls of the Torah to be able to read from the Torah on the Sabbath, and those Torah were not kept in homes.
Can I have a word, Ainsley? Yep. Anthony Motor, I was in the back of the car
Hi, how are
when you
you? Good to
drove
see you. Good to
Stokes
see you.
Hall and Holland. You skated past on the way between Savlamar and Alligator Pond. You skated past Black River. Are there any cemeteries in Black River? You know, or were there?
No, you know, I don't know why you come across and I hear the word, I hear the noise, but I'm not hearing the distinction of the words.
Oh, sorry. I'll talk a bit closer to the computer.
Slow.
I was in the back of the car when you drove to Holland and Stokes Hall last February with Peregrine. You skated past between Savlamar and Alligator Pond. Were there any cemeteries in Black River, you know, around Black River?
Well, we think there's a very small one in Black River, but we have not. I have not personally explored it. It has just recently come to light that there is, I think, 3 or 4 graves in Black River of Jews.
In the churchyard.
I don't know if Tony Porter, who is on the program, has any record of it, but I have not seen anything on it. I have not been to look for it in Black River, but that information came up recently, that there was a couple of graves. There's one of the other smaller ones are in places like Lacovia. I think there were 8 graves in Lacovia. Some of these places are really where people were buried. There's a whole family of Silveras, of the family Silvera, that is buried on a plantation that they owned called Crescent in St. Mary. So there are individual places where other burials took place, and we have most of those records. We also have a couple of records of where people were buried but have been washed away on the banks of a river. So, but we can only guess at some of those people, but there were not very many of those sites which were damaged. Other than the main one, I believe, is still historically the Savlamar Cemetery. But I think we have most of the Jews that possibly that lived in Jamaica, except for the early cemeteries in Kingston. There was an early cemetery in Kingston, and in a couple of places where we know that there was a grave or 2 still standing.
I was interested because my 3-times great-grandfather had a bunch of Cohen first cousins, and they were I think probably in the big estates in St. Elizabeth. Berlin was one. I just wondered what happened with that, was all really.
Ainsley, in the chat column, MD, sorry, I ought to know who MD is, but mentions that there is indeed a cemetery in Black River, discovered by MD with Alison Morris. So
yes, and as Marina has reminded me, Stan Mervis mentioned this in the book. So that's part of what I think I have also been privy to, but not necessarily. I've not been to see I think it's 3 graves. I've not been to see them. And today it's not as easy to get the kind of recognition that I would like to be able to have a little bit more of, but I think we have 98, 99% of most of it.
Marina, I apologize for not immediately recognizing your initials. So it's very nice to have you here. 5 markers in Black River.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Alison, yes, the CVE was supposed to have recorded it in 2015, but it doesn't occur in any of the earlier records.
Oh.
I am Cohen.
Marina, you've answered the question.
Ham Cohen is, as you identified, it is supposed to be buried there. And that's a name that has come into focus recently. So I have to do some genealogical work to find out more about him and his role in England.
He was the father of my 3 times great grandfather's cousins, and he's a man of great substance. You can tell how rich he was by the length of his will. It's about 13 pages.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as is happening in many parts of the world, congregations, small congregations, are shrinking. And the answer is not because people are leaving Judaism or whatever other religion, but young people are going to where there are new opportunities. And small countries and small congregations don't necessarily create those kind of opportunities. And so I have to admit that I have 7 grandchildren and they all live elsewhere.
Yeah.
So that's part of the story. And I think it's important for us to also recognize that we have a role to play, and the Commonwealth role, Commonwealth Heritage Foundation or Forum is an important organization for a very simple reason. Most small islands like ours are migratory experiences, but there are also other people who have created congregations or histories in various other countries. And part of the importance of what I'm speaking to is that we have to record how these situations were created, because these are histories which will get thrown out quickly and no understanding of why, how, or even where and by whom. So it's an important situation, I think, and I really appreciate the work that is being done by the Commonwealth Heritage Forum.
It's Bill Marlatt again. You may be interested in this. When we were restoring the cemetery, the walls have broken wine bottles, shards on top of the brick structure bedded in concrete. And some time ago, I bought a letter, and it was on eBay, and it's a letter from a wine merchant in Falmouth to Portugal ordering a shipment of Madeira wine. And I have a copy of it. If you're interested, I could email it to you, but it may connect. I'm sure the merchant was a Jewish merchant. It is probably in that cemetery.
I must tell you the truth. I think that the sound value of my computer is not working as clearly as it should. And so I hear your voice, but I don't hear your words expressed clearly. So I can't answer what you were saying.
Ainsley, can you hear me? Ainsley, can you hear me?
I can hear you saying, can you hear me? That's about it.
Well, I'm now going to just repeat Bill's question, Bill Marlatt's question. He, on eBay some time ago, bought a letter from a Falmouth merchant to Portugal asking for some Madeira wine.
Yes.
And he thinks he was a Jewish merchant, and he asked whether you would be interested in him emailing you a copy of this letter, because you might be able to identify.
I can certainly, I would love to have it. Email it to me. Ainsley at CW Jamaica.
Thank you. And thank you, Bill. How interesting.
No, and it's very interesting because, you know, again, it's not necessarily something, because we actually have created a Jewish museum in Jamaica at the synagogue, at the Heritage Center. And so we have a significant collection of information that is important to be able to, and in particular, young people coming in from school experiences that tell them about what our belief is, our history and heritage in Jamaica is, so that they feel, for whatever reason, in some cases, it may even be their grandmother having a Jewish name, and they feel comfortable that they've been where maybe some of her ancestors practiced Judaism. and it's all part of being able to create the unanimity of human beings, which we are facing across the world today in great trouble.
Thank you very much, Ainsley. We've got quite a few messages in chat, but I don't think they're particularly questions, but they're giving information, which is very, very helpful indeed. Thank you, Marina. Are there any other questions that people want to, or points people want to raise at this moment? Because otherwise, I think that Ainsley, you've wonderfully used the topic to inform us on a multitude of things, and all of which I'm talking to you about, and perhaps I can when I come out in January. But it's been, I think for me, it's been a fascinating talk, and I'm extremely grateful. And I'm sure that everyone who's been listening to you will have the same reaction. So may I thank you very much indeed. As I say, much to think on, much to think on. I think that probably brings this to an end, this particular session, but keep your eyes skinned on the Commonwealth Heritage Forum site for more talks. This talk will be available, a recording of it will be available from the Commonwealth Heritage Forum website very shortly. So,
it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. And I was happy to be able to do some research to find out a little bit more to share with you.
thank you so much. Thank you. Right.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Right.
Thank you, Ainsley. All right.
Hi, Steve.
Okay.
Good to see you, Mike. Good to see you.
Same here. On the top of your head.
Thanks a lot.